We like to think that the era of overt power politics is behind us, that the age when nations moved like pieces on a global chessboard of resources, territories, and subordinate allies has largely passed. There is a widespread assumption that modern states, particularly wealthy ones, no longer operate primarily through coercion or domination, but instead rely on diplomacy, trade, institutions, and law to settle disputes and manage competition. We imagine that any remaining conflicts are carefully managed, that the language of cooperation has permanently replaced the blunt logic of conquest. Yet, what if that assumption is no longer safe? What if beneath the surface of cooperation, the underlying logic of power and empire has quietly re-emerged, not announced with fanfare, but creeping in as a practical necessity? The unsettling possibility we face is not that the world has become suddenly violent or chaotic, but that the constraints we assumed were permanent, legal, economic, moral, have always been more fragile than we realized. Systems we thought were resilient may, under sustained pressure, begin to revert to older behaviors. And this does not happen because leaders are reckless, but because the very structures designed to maintain stability are faltering. When economies slow, when debt accumulates to unprecedented levels, when energy resources become scarce or politically contested, states do not respond with philosophical reflection. They respond pragmatically. They seek leverage, certainty, and control wherever they can find it. When these cannot be obtained through markets, diplomacy, or negotiation, history shows that states often revert to more direct means to secure their interests. This is where the danger truly lies, not in a single decision or a single misstep, but in the normalization of a mindset in which sovereignty becomes conditional, rules optional, and power justified by perceived necessity rather than consent. Once such a logic takes hold, it rarely confines itself to a single region or moment in time. It spreads quietly, altering expectations, recalibrating behavior, and fundamentally reshaping how power is exercised. For decades, many societies have lived under the comforting assumption that the most disruptive chapters of global politics were closed, that the lessons of the 20th century had been fully absorbed, and that economic interdependence had replaced coercion as the primary organizing principle of the world. But systems do not change simply because beliefs change. They change when material conditions shift. If the foundations of the global order are quietly, incrementally weakening without formal declaration, the critical question is not who is right or wrong in any individual dispute. The more pressing question is whether we are witnessing the early stages of a deeper systemic transition, one in which the rules designed to restrain the exercise of power no longer function as intended. If that is the case, the potential instability is not merely regional. It is systemic, with consequences that could reshape the global landscape for decades. At the global level, this topic matters because it touches the most sensitive fault line of all: the relationship between power and restraint. Every international order, no matter how idealistic its rhetoric may be, relies on the tacit calculation that the strongest actors believe that abiding by the rules serves their long-term interests better than breaking them. When that calculation begins to shift, the system does not collapse immediately, but it begins to fray. The post-war global order, which emerged from the devastation of the mid-20th century, was built on a fragile compromise. Power was not eliminated. It was contained, constrained by institutions, norms, and interdependence. Military force was meant to be exceptional rather than routine, and economic integration was designed not to erase competition, but to reduce the incentive for direct confrontation. Institutions were created not primarily to make the world fair, but to make it predictable. For decades, this arrangement delivered a relative stability, even as inequalities persisted and regional conflicts simmered beneath the surface. What makes the present moment different is not any single action or isolated decision, but the accumulation of pressures acting on the system simultaneously. Global economic growth has slowed. Debt levels across both public and private sectors have reached historic highs. Aging populations are straining public finances in multiple regions. Energy, once abundant and cheap, has re-emerged as a strategic vulnerability. In such conditions, The margin for error narrows, cooperation becomes harder to sustain, and the temptation to convert economic weakness into geopolitical leverage grows stronger. Small anomalies, which once might have been dismissed, now take on outsized significance. They begin to signal shifts in how power is exercised and justified. If major states start treating sovereignty as negotiable and intervention as a tool of economic management, the implications extend far beyond the immediate region. The rules governing investment, trade, and security become less reliable, dependent less on shared norms than on political alignment. For markets, this introduces a novel and profound type of instability. Capital thrives on predictability, not goodwill. When geopolitical decisions increasingly override economic logic, risk premiums rise, long-term planning contracts, and volatility become structural rather than cyclical. Energy markets, in particular, become more politicized, amplifying price swings and transmitting shocks across borders. Power relations shift in subtler ways as well. Smaller and medium-sized states must reassess their assumptions, recalibrating alignment from a choice of convenience to a strategy of survival. Strategic autonomy narrows. In response, rival powers feel compelled to solidify spheres of influence, not necessarily out of aggression, but out of fear of exclusion. The long-term consequence is not constant war, but chronic uncertainty. A world in which rules are applied selectively is not a world without order. It is a world with competing orders, layered and overlapping. And historically, such systems are unstable. Not because they produce immediate crisis, but because they erode trust over time. At stake is not merely regional stability or the legitimacy of individual governments. The more profound question is whether the global system can continue to manage competition through restraint, or whether it is gradually shifting toward a more fragmented, power-centric logic. In this scenario, economic and political stability are no longer separable. The path that brought us here was incremental, shaped not by sudden rupture, but by a series of decisions made under the assumption that the system was resilient enough to absorb them. After the Cold War, a broad consensus emerged among major economies. Market integration would replace territorial competition, financial flows would substitute for military force, and disputes would be managed through institutions rather than coercion. Even when conflicts occurred, they were framed as exceptions rather than indicators of systemic transformation. But beneath this surface stability, deeper imbalances were forming. Globalization delivered efficiency and growth, yet it also concentrated wealth, hollowed out industrial capacity in many countries, and created sprawling supply chains that prioritize cost over resilience. Finance expanded faster than productive investment. Debt replaced income growth as the stabilizing mechanism for advanced economies. These trends were tolerated because they postponed crises, even as they increased systemic vulnerability. Meanwhile, the credibility of international institutions gradually weakened, not because they failed outright, but because they became disconnected from the lived realities of the populations they were meant to stabilize. When crises erupted, responses often protected the system rather than ordinary citizens. This eroded trust, both domestically and internationally, making cooperation more fragile. Another turning point came with the recognition that the post-Cold War unipolar moment had ended. As new economic powers expanded their influence, the implicit bargain of the global system began to unravel. Competition returned, not as ideology, but as strategy. States recalibrated priorities. Security concerns began to override economic orthodoxy, and resources such as energy, technology, and geography regained strategic significance. Crucially, this shift was not announced formally. It unfolded through practice. Sanctions became more frequent. Trade was weaponized. Financial systems were leveraged as tools of pressure. Each step was justified as necessary, temporary, or defensive, yet cumulatively these actions signaled a departure from the assumption that economic interdependence alone could restrain power. Over time, the distinction between economic policy and geopolitical strategy blurred. Dependence could be exploited, and avoiding dependence sometimes required intervention rather than cooperation. The present moment emerges from the convergence of long-term trends: economic fragility, institutional fatigue, renewed great power competition, and the strategic reemergence of scarcity. These pressures do not act in isolation. Together, they create conditions in which older logics, control, dominance, exclusion, no longer seem unthinkable. This reversion is shaped less by ideology than by perceived necessity. At the core are economic pressures that have built up largely out of public view. These pressures do not dictate outcomes directly, but they narrow the choices available to governments. One major constraint is debt. Across much of the global economy, public and private debt has grown faster than productive capacity. Low interest rates mask the consequences for a time, allowing borrowing to substitute for growth. But debt is not neutral. It creates dependence on stable financing conditions, predictable capital flows, and confidence in solvency. When these factors weaken, states become more defensive. Rising inflation compounds the problem. Inflation is not merely a monetary phenomenon. It reflects supply constraints, energy costs, and geopolitical disruptions. It erodes purchasing power, destabilizes politics, and constrains policy flexibility. Governments facing persistent inflation are under pressure to secure predictable access to essential inputs, particularly energy, which shifts priorities from efficiency to control. Trade, once assumed to stabilize global relations, becomes fragile. Optimized global supply chains deliver efficiency at the cost of resilience. Disruptions, whether from conflict, sanctions, or political decisions, ripple rapidly. States reassess exposure, reclassifying strategic goods and conditioning trade. Capital flows respond to these shifts, seeking safety and liquidity rather than long-term opportunity. Geopolitical considerations increasingly override economic logic, heightening market volatility and reinforcing domestic and international instability. Sanctions play a pivotal role in this dynamic. Initially designed as a non-military tool, they have expanded in frequency and scope. While effective in the short term, sanctions fragment the global economy, prompting the creation of parallel financial systems, alternative trade routes, and localized supply chains. Over time, these adjustments weaken the integrative power of global markets and incentivize states to secure resources directly, bypassing exchange. Energy sits at the intersection of all these pressures. When markets are stable, energy recedes into the background. When constrained, it dominates decision-making. Energy scarcity or volatility amplifies inflation, strains public finances, and weakens growth. For indebted states, this is particularly destabilizing. High debt reduces resilience, inflation constrains policy, fragile trade networks increase risk. Volatile capital flows magnify shocks, sanctions fragment markets. Energy insecurity links all of these pressures, making economic policy inseparable from strategic considerations. Power is never abstract. It is exercised through geography, institutions, and the physical realities of distance, access, and proximity. While technology has accelerated influence projection, it has not eliminated geography's importance. Strategic geography defines what is vital, tolerable, or unacceptable. Areas close to a major power's core are rarely neutral. They serve as buffers, transit zones, or spheres of influence, where instability is interpreted as a direct threat. Military posture reinforces these dynamics. Rapid deployment, secure supply lines, and sustainable presence reduce uncertainty and create escalation dominance. Alliances interact with geography in complex ways. Formal alliances provide legitimacy and shared capacity, but constrain unilateral action. Areas outside formal obligations often become zones for assertive testing. Institutional power extends influence, but only if recognized and accepted. When confidence erodes, institutions shift from constraints to contested arenas. Geography, military posture, alliances, and institutions converge, producing subtle but important shifts. Influence is exercised where advantages are greatest and risks manageable. Actions framed as defensive can appear expansive to others. Over time, Regions solidify as zones of influence, alliances are stress-tested, and institutions face selective enforcement pressures. These shifts are incremental, often unnoticed, but cumulative. They gradually reshape the global landscape. The consequences affect governments, markets, and ordinary citizens in ways that are subtle yet enduring. Policy space narrows. Leaders face harder trade-offs. Decisions made for strategic reasons carry fiscal costs and political risks that persist long after the original objective. Citizens experience indirect effects. Price stability erodes, employment becomes less secure, public services face strain. Psychologically, predictability declines, trust weakens, and behaviors shift. Households save more, communities become risk-averse, political polarization deepens. Periods of structural transition rarely announce themselves. They are recognized by a growing sense that familiar assumptions no longer hold. The system continues to function, but with increased friction and reduced capacity to absorb shocks. Mistakes carry higher costs. Actions taken today reverberate further than anticipated. Power can shape outcomes, but cannot restore the conditions that once made stability easier to maintain. Influence expands in some areas, even as control diminishes over others. Looking ahead, three broad scenarios are plausible. In a best-case scenario, the system absorbs shocks and restores restraint. Governments recognize the costs of coercion and revert to negotiation, strengthening institutions and pursuing managed competition. The most likely scenario is ambiguous. Restraint persists sporadically. Coercion becomes normalized as a tool used selectively, and the global economy fragments into overlapping spheres of influence. Chronic uncertainty becomes the new baseline. In a worst-case scenario, competitive coercion accelerates, producing cascading breakdowns of trust. Sanctions harden into permanent separation, energy markets are strategically managed, and smaller states face coercive alignment pressures. Military postures become more forward, decisions are automated, and the risk of miscalculation rises. Which path emerges will be shaped less by rhetoric than by material conditions. Fiscal capacity, energy stability, alliance cohesion, and institutional credibility. Structural change does not arrive suddenly. It emerges incrementally as rational decisions made under pressure collectively transform the landscape. Control appears exercised, but the environment is increasingly constrained, reactive, and unpredictable. Uncertainty becomes structural, not temporary. Power alone cannot restore past conditions. Stability must be navigated, not assumed. In such a world, humility becomes as important as strength, and restraint as consequential as capability. The contours of the emerging global order will be shaped quietly, persistently, and without clear declaration. The choices leaders make now, the decisions about cooperation, coercion, and risk, will resonate far beyond the immediate horizon, influencing markets, institutions, and everyday life. Ordinary citizens will feel the effects not through sudden crisis, but through chronic friction, uncertainty, and incremental disruption. The global system may not collapse outright, but its capacity to absorb shocks, manage competition, and maintain predictability is increasingly constrained. Recognizing this reality is essential. Leverage does not equal foresight, and the pursuit of certainty under conditions that no longer support it may produce outcomes more difficult to control than the threats it seeks to mitigate. History is not predetermined, but the margin for error is narrowing. Stability must now be actively maintained through careful navigation, rather than taken for granted. This is a moment defined less by immediate crisis than by the slow, persistent pressures reshaping the international system. How institutions respond, how rivals interpret actions, and how economic constraints evolve will determine whether the world stabilizes, fragments, or drifts toward chronic insecurity.